We are getting started and we are moving on to our next discussion. And actually, it's a panel. It is something that I think it's a subject that is very, very important. I know we just heard from Luann, who spoke about some of the services that are offered at different school districts across the state of Texas. Um, the panelist for our next session is I know myself being a judge when I first got on the bench and having the luxury of representing school districts, I was very aware of a lot of this terminology, such as FAPE, 504, IEP, ARDS. I represented school districts in many type of special ed litigation. So I was very familiar, but when I would speak about it, the probation officers would have this puzzled look on their face, like, what are you talking about? And I would say, well, is a child in 504 or they have special ed services? And they pretty much would think it was the same thing, and it isn't. So I'm so excited that that this is a discussion for today because it's extremely relevant in courtrooms and, of course, throughout the juvenile justice system. So this panel is going to discuss and identify procedures and access to services that schools are required to provide for students, available community services and resources, and why they are relevant in the juvenile, family, or CPS court proceeding. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have Sarah Beebe. She is a supervising attorney for the Juvenile Probation Education Advocacy Program at Disability Right Texas, a nonprofit law firm and member of the Federal Protection and Advocacy Network for People with Disabilities. She became the supervising attorney of the JPEA team in 2015. In this role, she supervises a team of advocates and attorneys who provide education advocacy services to justice-involved youth, as well as technical assistance and advice to the justice system actors. We have Angelita Hunter, who has been employed by the City of McKinney Municipal Court for 7 years as a clerk, the judicial clerk, and now as a court supervisor. She is a 2020 graduate of the Texas Partners in Policymaking and a 2020 graduate from the Texas Partners in Disability Leadership. She is also on the National Council of Developmental Disabilities for Texas. Ms. Hunter serves on the committee for the Collin County Mental Health Symposium. Her primary focus revolves around continuously enhancing the quality of life for all juveniles by improving the community's continuum of care models. Kristin McGuire is our next panelist. She began her career as a special ed teacher and throughout her teaching years took additional roles of testing coordinator, special education coordinator, campus special education lead teacher department chair, and instructional coach. She then transitioned to education policy, where she worked at the Texas Association of School Boards, TASB, for nearly 10 years as a policy consultant and analyst. Most recently, prior to her arrival at TEA, she served as Director of Governmental Relations for the Texas Council of Administrators of Special Education for 5 years. In September of 2022, Ms. McGuire began her position at TEA as Senior Director, Special Education Programs and Policy. Last, but certainly not least, we have Ms. Josette Saxton, who is also going to be being the moderator for this panel. Ms. Saxton currently serves as the Director of Mental Health Policy for Texans Care for Children. Her current areas of focus include mental health in schools and youth suicide prevention, along with improving services and support for children with complex mental health concerns and their families. She also works on policies related to youth substance abuse. She has been with Texas Care for Children since 2004, working on early childhood policy before focusing on children's mental health. Over the last several years, Ms. Saxton has played a leading role in proposing and passing legislation and is frequently invited to testify at the Texas legislators. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to our moderator. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. I know we have quite a panel here, and I'm really looking forward to, like you, learning more from the perspectives of those folks that are really working on behalf of, I think, students who have or are at risk for special education services. What I wanted to do, though, is before we get started, is remind everybody, or at least let you all know that when it comes to kids with mental health concerns, kids who have been impacted by trauma, that the majority of them won't be eligible for special education services. And so I wanted to do a quick overview just to give you an idea or a reminder of what are some of the things that are facing kids in a typical classroom in Texas. So I'll just go through this. It's talking a little bit about my organization. One of the things that I want you to do today is to walk away with knowing that many kids in Texas face non-academic challenges that interfere with their learning, their mental health, and their behavior. And so we know that there are services and supports that are available in schools to really look at those academic sort of let's say when a student is struggling academically, but also we need to remember that there's other things that are going on that aren't related to their learning that are affecting how well students can really engage and be successful in the classroom. So this is the most recent data that we have for here in Texas, and this represents Texas high school students, grades 9 through 12. So it's not national data, this is Texas data. And the numbers are representative of statewide high schools. This is a survey that is done every 2 years through our Department of State Health Services in conjunction with the CDC. And so again, I won't go through all the numbers, but if you'll see here too that we know that there are a significant number of kids who are struggling at home, that they're separated from their parents, they're struggling financially, and then again, mental illness and substance use in the home. All of these things are considered adverse childhood experiences that we know can have not only negative impacts for kids right now, but these are things that are known to increase risks for a lot of physical and emotional mental health behavioral outcomes going forward into adulthood. Again, this is just some more data that was gathered. Again, Texas high school students, 9th through 12th grade. The one that really strikes me here is, look at that last one. Well, more than half of our high school students said that they feel they do not matter to people in the community. And I think back to when we were hearing from, Jennifer speaking about what are some of those things that really made a difference throughout her, sort of experiences, is when she felt, I think, seen and heard, connected, respected, and valued. A lot of our kids in the classrooms don't feel this way. Again, more data. Look at the number of kids that are reported symptoms of depression. And that was just within the past year. This was data that was collected, in 2021, so this is during the pandemic. 22% seriously considered suicide, and 12% attempted suicide at least once in the previous year. So again, to put this into context, if you have a classroom with an average of 25 kids, what is that educator, what is that teacher likely to have in front of her? She is likely to have at least 3 students who attempted suicide or experienced electronic bullying. About 4 students in there experienced verbal abuse at home. Can't see at the bottom, it looks like it was cut off, but a parent who was incarcerated and separated from the child. I won't go reading all of them, but again, that number, about 13 students experienced that they did not matter to people in their community. All of this to say is when our kids are coming into their classrooms and where we want them to really be able to focus on their schoolwork, to manage their behaviors, and their to be able to manage those emotions that we know that come with just being a teenager. There's a lot going on there. Okay, takeaway number 2. Thankfully, or I was jumping ahead when I'm saying thankfully, there's going to be some resources I will share with you, but rather the takeaway number 2 is that districts are required to address student mental health and to provide them with supportive environments that are not only physically safe from violence, but also where they feel emotionally safe, psychologically safe. And again, this is something where I won't go through all of, some of the places in in the state statute that requires schools to engage in certain activities. I know this material will be shared with you after if you're interested in digging a little bit deeper. But know that when you're working with families, when you're working with schools, the schools should have plans in place to address things like mental health and substance use prevention and intervention, positive behavior interventions and supports, helping students when they're returning to their classrooms after a hospitalization. There is even, it's not on this slide, but there's even legislation that's saying, or a statute that says schools have to have a plan in place to help students who are transitioning back from a alternative education program. Oops. Uh-oh. How do I get back? I hope nobody gets vertigo. Let me see. I might need some help in trying to figure out how to get back to my slides, although I'm just going to go old school. Okay, there. Oh, okay, it looks like some of my slides are missing. Oh, okay. So, trust me when I say that there's a few other laws that are in place that help schools address what to do if a student is struggling. Another big one that's not up here is having a multidisciplinary team in place that can assess students who have been identified as having a potential threat to self or others. And so you might have heard about all of this. They're called like behavioral threat assessment teams. This was legislation that was passed following the tragedy at Santa Fe High School. While a big focus of that is looking at preventing somebody who might do harm to others, a lot of it is also, from what we're hearing from schools, is that they're catching kids that it's more at risk of suicide. But stemming from that legislation, schools should have some things in place, again, to address these issues. These are laws that are not requiring schools or expecting schools to be mental health providers. That's not their role. But they do have to have plans in place to say how they can connect families to resources to help address some of those issues that not only help with their mental health, but really it helps them to be more focused in school. Forgive me while I pull my notes. And so one of the big takeaways, well, this is one where I think what you really should do is maybe take down, I want to just share with you a website that I think is being a really great resource that can help not only schools identify what things are available in the community to help address student mental health, but they're also available to you. So in other words, even though these are resources that were created to help schools provide safe and supportive learning environments for their students, it also includes a lot of great resources that you can search in your area that are available related to mental health, prevention and early intervention, and other types of things. And that is, so I think if you really just Google schoolmentalhealthtx.org. I'll say it again, and it's all one string, schoolmentalhealthtx.org. This is a website that was created in conjunction with the Texas Education Agency, the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health, which is out of UT Austin School of Social Work, using federal grant money. But it really does provide a wealth of information for schools on how to address student mental health. There is one key resource that I think everybody will find helpful in here who's ever works with family or kids. You can find this resource directly on that web page, but it has its own link, which is the same thing. It's schoolmentalhealthtx.database.org. And this is why I regret that my slides aren't here, because I put pretty snapshots that you could sort of see and orient about what's there. But really what you can do, it gives you the ability to type in, let's say, based on what county you're in, what education service center region that you're in. And even if you're looking for a particular type of service, you can go in there and it pulls up information, again, just for your area. So I think what I'm going to say to you too, as you're working with families, as you're working with schools, and you're really trying to wrap students around with services and support that could address, some of the needs that they might have related to their mental health, this is a resource where you can go to for help. And again, I think that was probably my final takeaway too, is we know a lot of kids are struggling. Schools are required to help support students, and there are resources that are available. Now, for some students, like I said, for some students, they actually will need additional services and supports. And this is where I think we are going to learn more about some of those numbers and acronyms that you might hear when you're talking with folks related to special education.
All right, thank you. Yes, so as Josette said, planning this particular session, we wanted to very quickly try and lay a foundation of what's called special education in Texas. And along with that, as mentioned earlier, kind of what is Section 504, what does that mean as it pertains to the education of our K-12 kids in Texas. So I will be very brief in this, but obviously, happy to take questions after if anyone has questions, but of course we'll have some conversation too. So very quickly, we will talk about, what is special education, what is Section 504, and just those common acronyms that you hear a lot in relation to kids that have identified disabilities and the supports that they receive in school. So what is special education? So special education is guided by a federal law called Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so this is a law that essentially, in exchange for federal monies, states and districts have to agree to provide to find any student who may have a disability that requires special education services, evaluate, identify, and serve those students. So districts are obligated on what's called a child find obligation to find all students that have or potentially have disabilities that would require special education. And then if identified, to develop and implement what's called an individualized education program or IEP to assist that student in accessing school services and the general education environment. So what is special education? Again, we all would love a very, black and white answer, but essentially what the federal law describes special education as is specially designed instruction. So you hear that acronym a lot too, is SDI. So specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of that student with a disability. So this is where the committees, where we'll talk about in a little bit, committees of professionals as well as the parent and the student, when appropriate, develop a plan to implement services based on that student's unique needs in order to access the general curriculum. So the IEP, what's the Individualized Education Program? So the IEP is, they call it a written statement, even though it's a lot of information. It's a lot of information about that particular student and his or her identified disability, and it is developed, reviewed, and obviously then implemented and revised, at least annually, based on or from a committee in Texas. We refer to this committee as the Admission Review and Dismissal Committee. In federal law and regulations, it's just termed the IEP team or IEP committee. Texas, we do things differently, so we have a different name, but they are the same team. That IEP, as I mentioned, has a lot of information in there. This talks about just the present levels of achievement of that particular student, how the student will access state and district-wide assessments, if they are of a certain age, especially beginning at 14, there is a lot of conversation and goal setting around transition services. What will happen to this student? What does the student desire post-high school and post K-12 education? And how will this committee help get that student there? talks about obviously that STI. What is the special education that the student needs in order to access the curriculum? So you hear a lot about ARD committees, IEPs. IEPs are those documents that facilitate how a student will access the curriculum based on his or her disability. So there are kind of two prongs to the definition of a child with a disability as it relates to special education. So when we're talking specifically about special education with that IDEA umbrella, there are sort of two prongs. The student has to have a disability that is also one of the disability categories that are outlined in that federal law. So they are identified with that disability, and because of that disability, they are based on that disability, they need special education in order to access the curriculum. So there's two prongs. They have to need special education services in addition to their identified disability. And that's what the committee then decides. So just a little bit about those disability categories. So, a lot of times you may hear a student, well, they're identified with LD or SLD. That's a specific learning disability. You've got speech impairment. There's fancy animation in here, but you can see the list here. And, there's one category, of course, in federal law, they talk about a term called developmental delay, that if it's sort of, you've got a child up to, I believe the federal law allows it up to 9. Here in Texas, we do up to 5. There's kind of a non-categorical early childhood disability type. But you can see that those are the categories of disability eligibility. And then, of course, you have the conversation of, do they need special education services because of that disability? So technically, special education is kind of, we say that, but special education also coordinates with what we call related services. So related services are services that a student can access, like assistive technology, if they need augmented communication devices, if they need particular counseling services, or sometimes even music therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy. If there are those services that a student needs in the school system, and that is part of their services to access the curriculum, then that ARD committee also discusses, oh, here's your, I think this might be your slides. These are not my slides. No. Well, no, this looks like somebody else's slides. Okay, well, my slides are gone. So I'll just pull them up on, let me go backwards. Oh, I'm still not going backwards. Okay, well, I'm going to pull, you have them on your online, so I guess I can just pull up what you have there, unless we want to try to fix that while I'm talking, but I know we're running out of time here. So let me just quickly go through, let me pull up my slides here. So I know this is on your resources page as well, so you can access those. Okay, so real quickly, I will go through, so related services is part of that. What you also have on your slide is just in general, part of the comparison when we look at Section 504 and your IDEA special education is there are some very specific dispute resolution options or rights of parents under IDEA that are not necessarily under 504. So you have a slide on different dispute resolution methods that are offered to parents and districts, but to parents in relation to any challenges that they face through the school system of accessing the special education services. So that's there for your review too, just to kind of compare the two. So then there are some slides about Section 504. So Section 504, of course, is part of the Rehabilitation Act. And so this is really kind of that civil rights statute of ensuring you do not discriminate against people with disabilities. And so that continues into, of course, the education system. So Section 504 does still have a FAPE component, that free appropriate public education component. and so districts are obligated because of that, that obligation to provide this education in order, again, for a student identified with a disability to access services just as well as someone without a disability. So with Section 504, the eligibility is different. You have to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. It's pretty broad in terms of what that could look like. So in action, in implementation, in schools, you have generally what's called a Section 504 committee, which is a team of professionals who talk about this student's identified disability and how, what accommodations that student needs in order to access the curriculum. Now, interestingly, or I guess to kind of compare the two, although most, and I would hope all, but although most districts do invite parents to every 504 meeting, parents are not required members of these particular committees. And so there is a distinction as well between IDEA and Section 504 as well. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, so real quickly, just some other acronyms that you'll have in your slides. Again, we talked about ARD before, so admission, review, and dismissal. That is both the committee and the meeting in relation to a student identified with special education needs. FAPE is that free appropriate public education. So the standard of FAPE is a little bit different between the two as well. So that's something more, that districts are in the weeds with, but it is something to remember. Sometimes you might hear a student had a BIP in school. And so a BIP is a behavior intervention plan. And so when you have a student who faces some challenges with behavior and needs needs the team to create a plan to help with those particular behaviors, the ARD committee can develop a BIP or a behavior intervention plan that is that then becomes, of course, a required component of the IEP and is required to be reviewed. So MD, you might hear an MD, they had an MD meeting or an MD ARD. That's manifestation determination. Again, this is in relation to particular challenges with discipline. So if you have a student who has a disability who receives a disciplinary action that changes them from their normal placement, there is law associated with when you have to come together as an ARD committee, in this case, when we're talking about special education, to talk about, was this behavior that prompted this change in placement, did it result because of their disability? And was the behavior due to the school's failure to implement the IEP? And so ARD committees have to come together to discuss those two questions, which then sort of dictates the steps from there in terms of whether the student continues with that placement or whether there are other responsibilities that kick in for the ARD committee. So in your slides as well, I did offer just some links to some documents on the agency's website, as well as some other external links, just in case you do have situations where you have some questions and you want to find out more about it. But I will stop for now so we can answer some questions with the panel.
I just want to say thank you so much for reminding us that we have all the slides available on the handy dandy, our mobile devices or laptops. I know I found it just checking my email address that the folks at the commission sent us a link. So if you're looking for additional slides and resources from any of the presentations, go check your email. But thank you. So again, that was almost like a crash course, an overview of what schools are required to do to some extent, related to, I think, all students, as well as students who are eligible for special education services. Oh, and is there one question before we get started with the panel back there? Yes?
It's ARD, it's admission, review, and dismissal. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I mean, our expectation would be that they're invited to every meeting, but technically within the law, they're not required members, but they should be at the district level encouraged to attend.
I want to touch on that too. Now, if it's a ARDS or IEP, then yes, they have to be enacted. The school has to make that attempt to contact them and have them be a participant. And it has to be documented and written down in multiple times. And with the 504, however, that's different. Best practice is to always involve a parent. However, it doesn't require it by statute.
Thank you. So I want to know, again, we just gave, a lot of information and overview. And Sarah, can you tell us, why is this important for folks who are working within the courts to be aware of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. So my work is exclusively with justice-involved youth. I work with a team of advocates and attorneys who provide education advocacy services to our justice system-involved youth every single day. And some of the challenges that I see our youth with disabilities face in the justice system are that the school-to-prison pipeline is not just a term that we use here in Texas. It's enacted by statute. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that when a student who becomes involved with the juvenile justice system, the district attorney's office is required to provide notice to the school in most offenses, maybe not all, but in most offenses, tell the school, hey, this kid has been arrested, this is what their offense is for. And then the Texas Education Code allows the school district to take disciplinary action against that student. So why is this important for our students with disabilities? Well, as Kristin just explained, our students with disabilities have extra protections, special protections when it comes to discipline at schools. So it's important for justice system professionals to be aware that when a student is going to be disciplined at school, a special education student or a 504 student, they're entitled to that manifestation determination review meeting where they have to talk about, was this behavior this child engaged in substantially related to the disability? Did this happen because of their disability? And another question they have to ask is, did the school fail to follow their individual education plan? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, well, they cannot be disciplined. And so it spares them the trauma of having to attend these very punitive disciplinary alternative education programs. And I'll leave it at that. I have lots to say.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah, I am.
So I am a parent and I'm also a court staff member. So I want to kind of share my experience as both. As a parent, my son has went through this process and I dug deep and try to figure out what all can the courts do, because I am a court supervisor. Therefore, I discovered that, we all go by timetables for remedies, appellate timetables, their case management of the court. We have to make sure it's when between those statutes and those timetables. That also occurs in the schools. So the school has a local grievance policy. They also have a charter that they have to go by. They will sometimes they call it due process. It's not necessarily due process as far as the state's concerned. They call it due process at the local. After that due process, the parent can appeal it to the school board. You have to be careful and to confirm that appellate timetable and that parent was allowed that. For me and my son, we had the due process hearing, immediately walked out of that meeting, and they made the MDR right then. So that violated my appellate timetable. Furthermore, if there is something out there as far as anything at all that has to do with their disability, a manifestation, let's say, for instance, that child was given 1 day OSS, just like my son was. And then a week later, they say, oh, this broke the student code of conduct. Now we're going to MDR. In itself, them given 1 day of OSS for an incident, they already said that was in direct violation, that was a direct manifestation of his disability because they gave him 1 day OSS. But because there's criminal charges now, we're going to up those. And we're going to have those up so high that it's a felony because we're going to throw public servant on there. And now that's a felony, that's DAEP by state statute. You see what I'm saying? So there's mechanisms and there's ways of doing things that I feel we all are accountable in our professional capacity. We need to hold everyone else at that standard and understand these processes for these kids that are coming in and that you're viewing and they're before you, or you're helping them, or you're trying to get them services. Because ultimately, you don't know what you just don't know. People have been doing that for years and they don't know any better. I don't think that anyone's actually looked at this wheel and said, we could do this so much better. Let's look at it this way. My comments are not to be combative, but it's to hopefully, inspire thought process and critical thinking, like, oh yeah, if we did that, something of that nature might have not occurred. So I want y'all to look at those when you see these kids come in, and think of it as your child. How would you interact with them? What processes should be in place? Because, I thought about this ever since they asked me to speak, and I thought, what would I say to 15-year-old Angie to get her on board? And I don't necessarily know what that is, except for the fact that if you see a child in Target and they're being restrained on the floor by their parents, that is, sometimes they get CPS called on you. You get your child's taken away from you. In a school environment, changing the address of an incident that causes trauma does not change abuse. So I want y'all to keep that in mind. And I'm not trying to say it's abuse as far as malicious abuse or trauma. That's not it at all. This is the way it's always been. I'm trying to state that is very, very, very much a contributing factor to how they view school and how they engage at school. And 89% of people that commit suicide that are juveniles all had dyslexic kind of writing in their suicide notes. The schools have an affirmative right to provide FAPE and to also provide access to FAPE. So those are two different tracks. And I just kind of want to, let y'all know, I could speak all day on this topic, so I'll stop now. However, if you need help, if you're not buying, you're on the bench, I need some counsel. I have some attorneys that also do counsel for judicial officers. They will help you. They'll speak with you. They'll give you what they know. So you can make sure that you're checking all of the boxes. All of us, anyone in the state that is 18 years age or older, are mandated reporters. We should all make sure that we are all doing the things that need to be done for the kids to have the life that they're intended to have and be successful in life. So.
Thank you for that. And it makes me think too that if our intended goal is to, let's say, we want kids to succeed, and if some of these barriers to success, let's say in school education or behavior wise, are a manifestation of their disability, or I'll even say, let's say trauma, they might not have a disability, but if they are responding from trauma, what do these responses that do they help to change those behaviors? I guess what I'm saying. So what you went through, did any of those the school responses when it comes to, let's say, the disciplinary approaches or being able to connect to services, did it help meet the goal of changing, I think, the behavior and helping your child be more successful?
Ultimately, my son, who is level 2 autistic, he also was, I guess 2 years ago, diagnosed with chronic multiple sclerosis. He has brain lesions. He's losing his vision. This occurred because he was stating that he had a headache and he wanted the light off, and it was his free time for a sensory break. Now, with that, they thought that he was having work avoidance. I don't like that word, work avoidance. It's not work avoidance. It's a behavior. Why is he not doing that? Anyway, he was telling the truth, but it was viewed in a separate manner. Restraints were tried, and that's an incident occurred. Fast forward 2 months, and he's in children's hospitals, and all of his cells are attacking his system. They can't figure out what's going on. And he had 3 brain lesions, and they can't say it's not a direct result from restraints being used over excessively. So I want to keep that in mind. They have very, very physical and mental effects. And now he's at home and he is going and participating in school once a week. I'm trying to build that trust back. You know, I took the appropriate steps to remedy the errors that I saw, and I believe that me and the school are acting, you know, the best we can to try to fix this for future incidents. With the child, though, with mental health, that kind of spears from that. My son is IDD. He has got a cognitive disability. However, that caused mental health issues. He told me he feels like he's an experiment. Why is everybody trying to fix him? So, I said I wasn't going to cry. This is very, very important to me. So, his experience has got it to where I help parents now. I volunteer. I go with them to their R meetings. I try to work collaborative with the school. Let's use this. Let's have a board certified behavioral analyst review these behaviors. Not a behavioral behavioral analysis. I can't say that correctly today. They are not board certified and they have no ethics to follow. All of those actually should be working under a BCBA. If it's not BCBA, board certified behavioral analysis, then I would ask for that. Number 2, any behavior impeding the learning, that means that they don't want to go to school. It might look like truancy coming in your court. Any behaviors like that, they need to go through child find. We all can ask for child find. They come into your courtroom, or if you're working them through your agency and you see there's no IEP here, why not? Send it over and say, I would like to recognize this child and ask for an assessment or child find. Yes, they're going to have the parent's permission. That's fine. They'll have to reach out to the parent. But I tell you this, and this is what scares me to death, guys and gals. The state has funding for IDEA and juvenile detention. In the event your child or anyone's child goes through that process, goes through the criminal justice system, gets found guilty, goes to juvenile detention, they do not have to serve them under IDEA or anything else. If they did not enter into the juvenile detention agency, or juvenile detention justice, prior to getting their IEP and getting recognized and identified and assessed, they don't have to. So these children are in jail right now, not diagnosed. There's no authority saying they have to be diagnosed. There's actually budgeting for how many kids are going to come in under those services. I would like to challenge, in United Spirit and all of us, let's look at what the state has in place, which is good. They have the school health advisory councils. They have House Bill 1204. They outline the SRO's role as well. In the last legislative update, all these things are all there. Texas they have it for us. Now let's just figure out a roadmap, like how to assess all that.
So I know we just have about a minute left, and what I would want to do is invite if there is any questions. I think we will be at a table outside immediately after, but I wanted to say too, Sarah, from your perspective, what are some areas of opportunity that you think we can pursue to address these issues? Like, what are some of the challenges and maybe opportunities?
Absolutely. Well, I want to just say really quickly to touch on what Angelita was speaking to. Here in the state of Texas, recent data has shown that we are sadly dead last in our special education eligibility out of all of the states. We have about 11% eligibility for special education in the state of Texas. It's getting better every year, but we have a lot of work to do. And so when we talk about what services are available for our justice-involved youth, for youth with mental health and behavioral health concerns at school, one of the things we need to do is look inward toward our schools to say, hey, let's do more evaluations. We have a major backlog in evaluations. But as Angelita was saying, anybody can assist a parent with asking a school to conduct an evaluation for special education services. There's just been significant under-identification of kids in Texas. We should be much more along the lines of other states that have more of a 15 or 20% eligibility rate in their states. 11% in Texas just doesn't make sense. So consider, if you are working with a youth who has a diagnosis, who's taking medication, or has other indicators that there may be a disability going on, of assisting them with asking for services at school.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.